I hadn't really noticed how quiet my new neighborhood was until the evenings grew longer, stretching into chilly, silent autumn nights. It wasn't the type of neighborhood where people kept their porch lawn past dusk or kids stayed outside playing after dinner. Instead, the houses here lined up like solemn sentinels, watchful but indifferent, as though they'd seen things long forgotten. I moved to this small town in the suburbs of Chicago after landing a decent-paying internship at a tech company nearby. My parents had helped me rent a small house on a quiet street, a house that, during the daytime, looked perfectly harmless. But at night, I felt a different side of it. The house itself had character, though. Old, with creaking floors and doors that sometimes wouldn't shut right, it felt as if the place had absorbed every year it had stood. When I'd first moved in, I noticed little things. Shadows that pooled in corners, long stretches of silence broken only by the odd pop of the old wooden floorboards. I told myself it was all in my head, just an old house settling into its bones. But as the days passed, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that it was more than that. That night, the air was crisp, and I had just settled in after a long day of work and class. The evenings had become routine. Dinner, some reading, and then bed, so I didn't expect any surprises. But when I opened my front door to grab a box of leftovers I'd forgotten in the car, there it was, a small package lying right on my doormat. I hadn't heard anyone approach or leave, and no one had rung the bell. For a moment, I stared at it, puzzled. There was no name on it, no postage stamps, nothing to suggest it had been mailed. Curiosity got the best of me. I crouched down, noticing a note taped to the package's top, written in sharp red letters. Open only at midnight, when you're alone. I'll admit I laughed a bit, thinking it might be some prank. I'd heard of weird neighborly traditions, but this seemed a little extreme. Maybe it was a Halloween trick since the season was around the corner. Still, something about it unsettled me. Midnight? Alone? I'd seen enough horror movies to know that this wasn't usually a good sign, but I was tempted. I brought it inside, placing the box on my small kitchen table, its cryptic note face up as I paced around. The hours dragged, each tick of the clock amplifying the quiet. I tried to distract myself, but that box was all I could think about. Midnight loomed closer, and the curiosity became harder to ignore. As the time ticked closer, I sat down at the table and stared at the package again, half expecting it to reveal its secrets if I looked hard enough. Finally, as the clock struck 12, I carefully opened the box. Inside was something small, an object carved from dark wood with an eerie, almost lifelike quality to it. It was a statue, about the size of my palm, its eyes hollow and its shape vaguely human. The strange thing was that it seemed old, far older than anything I'd expected to find here. Next to it was another note, written in the same red ink as the first. He lives in the dark. I felt a shiver race down my spine. The note made no sense, but the unsettling feeling crept in. He lives in the dark? The words echoed, bouncing around in my mind, as if they wanted to settle somewhere deeper. I placed the statue back in the box, telling myself it was a prank, someone's sick joke. But every time I looked at that statue, I couldn't help but feel its empty gaze. Suddenly, I was painfully aware of how silent the house was. And for the first time since moving in, I felt the weight of that silence. It pressed down on me, thick and suffocating, as if the very air in the room was watching. My gaze darted around, half expecting to see, what? Something? Someone? I shook it off, blaming the hour, the tiredness. But as I moved to turn off the light, a strange impulse stopped me. I don't know why, but I didn't want to leave the room in darkness, not completely. Still, eventually, I did. And as soon as the light flicked off, a chill wrapped around me. In the corner of the living room, near where the light met the shadows, I noticed it, a darker spot, just beyond my line of sight. My pulse quickened, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling as I strained to see it more clearly. It looked like a figure. A human shape, but silent, completely still, almost blending with the shadows. I blinked, thinking it was my imagination, just a trick of the mind. I flicked the light back on, and the corner was empty. Nothing there. But when I turned it off again, the figure was back, motionless, watching. I could feel its presence now, almost taste the cold that seeped from it, filling the air around me. My hands started shaking, my body frozen in place. I flicked the light on and off, desperately hoping it would go away, that it was just a figment of my imagination. But each time, it was there. The same dark figure, patiently waiting in the shadows. I bolted up the stairs, leaving every light on in my wake, heart pounding as I tried to convince myself it was nothing. But that night, as I lay in bed with the lights on, I knew something had entered my house, something that only the dark could reveal. After that night, things only got stranger. The following morning, I woke up feeling drained, as if I hadn't slept at all. The house was filled with an unnatural stillness, one that seemed to press against me. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I was tired, stressed with classes and work, and the weirdness of the previous night was nothing more than a coincidence. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something different now, a shift in the air, as if an invisible weight was slowly settling over everything. The statue was still on my kitchen table, its hollow eyes staring out at nothing. I tried to ignore it as I made my coffee, focusing on the warmth of the mug in my hands to ground me. But that damn thing had an aura, a quiet darkness that seemed to seep into the room. I could feel it pulling at me, its silent gaze unbroken, watching every movement I made. Each time I glanced over at it, my stomach twisted a little tighter, as though some primal part of me recognized it as a threat. I grabbed my backpack and rushed out, eager to escape the house. It was a relief to step outside, feel the chill morning air against my face, and leave the strange heaviness behind, even if just for a few hours. School was its usual chaotic mess, professors droning on and classmates complaining about assignments, a comforting monotony that distracted me from the unsettling memory of last night. By the time I returned home that evening, the unease had faded a bit. The house, however, seemed darker than usual as I walked in, even though it was only dusk. After dropping my stuff, I reached to turn on the living room light but froze mid-motion. There it was again, in the corner of the room, just where I had seen it the night before. A shape, barely visible, yet unmistakably there. A cold sweat broke out across my skin as I forced myself to flick the light switch. The figure vanished instantly, swallowed up by the brightness, leaving behind only the familiar walls and furniture. I shook my head, mumbling reassurances to myself. Just a trick of the mind. Nothing's there, just shadows. But as night deepened, I could feel that cold presence in every darkened corner of the house, like it was silently waiting. This wasn't just in my head. Something had changed, and I didn't know how to explain it. As I moved through the house, keeping the lights on in every room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I was so jumpy that every sound made me startle. The soft hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards under my weight, even the distant bark of a dog from the neighbor's yard. Every noise felt amplified, tinged with an edge of dread. The statue remained on the kitchen table, untouched, but its presence felt heavier than before. I wanted to throw it out, but some part of me was scared that if I touched it, I'd invite whatever was lurking into my life even further. It was ridiculous, I knew. It was just a hunk of wood. But every time I so much as glanced at it, my heart would race with a fear that I couldn't quite understand. And then, as the clock neared midnight, I noticed the note again, half hidden under the statue's base. He lives in the dark. The words, smeared slightly as if written in haste, seemed even more ominous now. Who was he? Was it just some prank? But if it was, why did it feel so personal? Like someone had known exactly what would unnerve me the most. Out of some misguided sense of bravery, I decided to turn off the lights. I was alone, the night was quiet, and a part of me was tired of feeling afraid of my own house. I flicked the switch, bathing the living room in darkness, standing there, waiting for something to happen. Silence filled the room, pressing down on me, suffocating. And then, from the corner, I saw it. The figure was back, clearer this time, as if it had been waiting, biding its time until I dared to call it out. The shape was dark, human-like, but distorted, hunched in a way that defied reason. It had no face, but somehow I knew it was looking right at me. My chest tightened, and I could barely breathe as the shadow inched closer, reaching the edge of the darkness. I scrambled for the switch, flooding the room with light again, and it was gone. No figure, no shadow, nothing to suggest I hadn't just imagined it. But my body knew better. My hands were shaking, my skin prickling with a feeling I couldn't shake. I stumbled back, barely able to keep my composure. The house was completely silent, as if nothing had happened, but I knew that wasn't true. The presence lingered, hiding just beyond the reach of light. I realized then that whatever this thing was, it wouldn't leave. It had come into my house and wasn't planning to go anywhere. I spent the rest of the night in my bedroom, lights on, the door locked, fighting the urge to look over my shoulder every few seconds. My mind raced with questions. Who had left the box? Why me? What was that thing in the dark? But no answer came, only the steady, suffocating dread that settled in every dark corner of my mind. As dawn crept in, I couldn't help but feel a chilling certainty. Whatever it was getting closer. And the dark, my only hope of escape, was now the very thing I feared the most. I barely slept that night, if you could even call it sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow, hunched in the corner, waiting patiently. It was the kind of exhaustion that burrowed into my bones, leaving me jittery and unable to relax, like my body was wired for an impending disaster. I tried to brush it off, told myself that all I needed was some sleep, that it would all make sense in the morning. But as the first light of dawn began to seep through the windows, I knew deep down that things had changed. Whatever had come into my house the night I opened that package had no intention of leaving. Throughout the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch just a bit too far. Every creak in the floorboards sounded like footsteps. I left every light in the house on, trying to keep that thing away, but even in the brightest corners, I could feel it lurking, waiting for the dark. Around noon, I found myself staring at the package again. I didn't want to touch it, but I had to know what I was dealing with. I gingerly picked up the statue, feeling the rough wood against my skin, and noticed something peculiar. It was warmer than it should have been, like it had absorbed something from the room, from me. I quickly put it back down, trying to shake off the dread that crept over me. That note kept echoing in my mind. He lives in the dark. Whatever this he was, it was no ordinary spirit. It was something older, something that fed on fear and darkness. I tried to piece together what I could about the house, the statue, anything. My hands shook as I searched online, combing through every obscure website, forum, and article. Eventually, I found an old newspaper clipping about the previous owner, a man named Ezra Morris. He'd been known around town as an eccentric collector, someone who'd amassed artifacts from all over the world, each piece rumored to have a dark history. His collection was filled with things that shouldn't be owned, as one article had put it. Ezra had disappeared mysteriously one night, his house left untouched, as if he had simply vanished into thin air. I read on, horrified, as the article mentioned a statue much like mine, something dark and wooden, that locals had said contained an ancient entity. Ezra's last known possession had been this very artifact, and shortly after acquiring it, he was never seen again. My heart pounded as I realized the implications. Ezra hadn't just vanished. He had likely been taken, claimed by whatever resided in that statue, whatever now lurked in my home. And if I didn't find a way to get rid of it, I would meet the same fate. I glanced over at the package and felt a wave of nausea, knowing that it was a portal, a cursed item binding me to something I couldn't see, couldn't control. I knew I had to act. In a desperate attempt to break free from this nightmare, I decided to follow one of the old rituals I'd read about in an occult forum. Take the cursed item to its place of origin, leave it in complete darkness, and seal it away. It was my only hope, my last shot at keeping myself from whatever fate had claimed Ezra. So I packed up the statue, wrapped it tightly in a cloth, and placed it back in the box. The sun was setting by the time I reached the abandoned lot where Ezra's house once stood. It was a patch of wild, unkempt land on the edge of town, a place everyone seemed to avoid. The box felt heavier as I approached, as if the statue inside knew what I was planning. I found a small hollow in the ground and dug as fast as I could, my fingers numb from fear and the cold. I placed the box inside, covering it with dirt until nothing was left visible, the dark filling the space around it. I backed away, watching as the last of the sunlight disappeared, leaving only shadows and silence. I thought I was free. I turned to leave, feeling the weight lifting from my chest, but then I heard it, a soft, rustling whisper from the dark. like the sound of wood scraping against wood, getting closer. I bolted, running faster than I'd ever run, not daring to look back. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears, the darkness around me feeling alive, stretching, reaching. I could almost feel it breathing down my neck. I stumbled into my car, slamming the door shut, my breath ragged, and gunned the engine. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart sinking as I saw it. The figure, standing at the edge of the lot, watching, its hollow gaze following me. I got back to the house and locked every door and window, leaving every single light blazing. But even in the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still with me. Days passed, and though I tried to convince myself I was safe, the shadows seemed darker, heavier, always lurking at the edges of my vision. One night, as I lay awake, staring into the corner of my room, I saw it again. The dark figure, patient and unmoving, standing just outside the circle of light. I closed my eyes, heart pounding, as I heard a voice, a soft whisper, almost amused, coming from the dark. He lives in the dark. The next morning, the lights began to flicker. One by one, each bulb in the house died, plunging me into darkness. I froze, the weight of the shadows pressing in around me, and finally, the truth settled in. It would never leave. I'd been marked, bound to the darkness by that cursed statue. No amount of light could save me, and as the last bit of light faded, I saw him stepping out from the shadows, his hollow eyes fixed on me. I had thought moving to a quiet apartment building in New York City would be a welcome change. After years of noise, constant traffic, and crowds, the calm, almost old-world charm of the building felt like a breath of fresh air. The place had character. Old brick walls, narrow hallways, and tall, narrow windows that caught just enough light during the day. Most of the tenants were older, some retired, others quiet types who nodded politely in the halls without much interest in conversation. At first, I thought it would be perfect. It was precisely what I needed after a tough year and a recent divorce, a quiet space to start over. But it didn't take long before things started to feel off. My neighbors were polite but distant, like they'd known each other for ages, and I was just an outsider who had interrupted their tightly knit routine. There was nothing overtly wrong at first, just a few things here and there that left me feeling out of place. Like how people would occasionally stop talking when I entered the lobby or hallway, offering a small nod and a vague smile before moving on. I figured I just needed time to settle in, to blend in. New faces always took a while to adjust, right? But then the stares began. At first, it was subtle. I'd pass an older woman on the third floor who would stare a little too long, or a man would watch me from the end of the hall as I unlocked my door, his gaze unblinking. I'd turn the corner, and from the corner of my eye, I'd see two neighbors standing together, whispering. The low murmurs would stop as soon as I got close, only to start again as I walked away. It was eerie, and after a few days I couldn't shake the feeling that they were always watching, their eyes following my every move. One night, as I came back from work, the hallway was strangely silent. It's not like my building was noisy, but this was different, an unnatural kind of stillness, thick and heavy. As I climbed the stairs, I felt an unsettling, prickling sensation along my spine. Turning the corner to my floor, I saw two of my neighbors, an elderly couple who lived across from me, standing side by side, directly facing my apartment door. They didn't move or say anything, just stood there, staring blankly at my door. I froze, heart pounding, unsure if I should greet them or just walk past. But before I could decide, they slowly turned their heads in my direction, eyes glassy and cold. I forced a polite nod and hurried to my door, fumbling with the keys, my fingers trembling. As I unlocked the door, I could feel their eyes on me, the weight of their stare pressing against my back. Finally inside, I locked the door, feeling the relief wash over me. But as I glanced through the peephole, I could see them still standing there, staring at my door, unblinking. After a few moments, they simply turned and walked back down the hall, disappearing into the shadows. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, convincing myself it was just an odd coincidence. Maybe they had been waiting for someone, or maybe it was some odd, harmless eccentricity. This was an old building, after all. The people here had been around long before I moved in. But every time I passed someone in the hall, I felt their eyes linger just a bit too long, and the quiet murmuring never seemed to stop. Over the following days, I began noticing other small, unsettling details. Things in my apartment felt different. A glass on the counter moved slightly from where I'd left it. A window that I could have sworn I'd locked was suddenly open. And then there was the persistent scent of candle wax, faint but unmistakable, as though someone had been burning candles somewhere close. One evening, as I walked down the stairs, I passed by a group of neighbors who were standing together, murmuring in low voices. They stopped as soon as I reached them, falling silent as they watched me pass. It was as if I had interrupted something private, something they hadn't meant for me to hear. I hurried past them, feeling their stares burning into my back. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were trembling and I could feel my heart racing. I glanced at the note left by the landlord when I moved in, detailing a few house rules, as he'd put it. One line stood out to me now, one I'd brushed off at the time. Please keep all lights off in the apartment at midnight. It had seemed strange then, but I'd chalked it up to another one of the building's many quirks. Now, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just an odd request. There was something dark here, something hidden in the walls, watching me along with my neighbor's quiet, secretive stares. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the silence. The thick, oppressive quiet of the building had a weight to it, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating. Every creak in the old wooden walls, every small sound made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something just beyond my sight, lurking in the dark, waiting. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that the new environment and the odd behavior of my neighbors were just making me paranoid. But deep down, I knew there was something more. Something had changed since I moved in, something I couldn't yet understand. And as I lay there, staring at the darkened corners of my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Days passed, but the uneasy feeling that had taken root in me only grew stronger. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in tighter each night, the shadows lengthening, stretching like they were reaching for me. I tried to ignore it, told myself that it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't leave me. The strange behavior of my neighbors grew harder to ignore. Every time I passed them in the halls, I felt their eyes on me, heavy and expectant, as if they were waiting for something. The murmuring grew louder, more frequent, and I began to catch snatches of words as I walked past. Soon, she's ready, the time is coming. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself they were just gossiping about something else, but the words echoed in my mind, taunting me. One evening, I returned home to find a strange note slipped under my door. The paper was old, almost brittle, with writing that looked like it had been scrawled in haste. "You are the final piece," it read. No name, no explanation, just those 5 words, hanging like a curse over me. I felt a chill run down my spine, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Who had left it? Why? I stared at the note, my heart pounding as fear gnawed at the edges of my mind. I checked the door, locked it, then double-checked every window, every lock in the apartment. But no matter how many times I reassured myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. There was someone, watching. Later that night, I heard the murmuring again, this time right outside my door. I froze, my heart pounding as I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to make out the words. It was a low, rhythmic chant, almost like a prayer, repeated in voices that sounded cold and detached. I couldn't understand the language, but I knew it was about me. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. The words flowed over me like icy water, sinking deep into my bones, leaving me numb with fear. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. I knew I needed answers, so I decided to do some digging. Late that night, I sat down at my computer, searching for anything about the building, its history, or its tenants. The landlord had mentioned it was one of the oldest buildings in the neighborhood, and judging by the architecture and the age of my neighbors, I didn't doubt it. But as I scoured the internet, I found nothing. No history, no record of its construction, no mention of any past owners. It was like the building didn't exist. Frustrated, I nearly gave up when I stumbled upon an old forum post on an obscure website about paranormal events in New York. It was dated over 40 years ago, but it mentioned a building that sounded eerily similar to mine. The post described a series of disappearances tied to a cult, a group that believed in extending life by drawing energy from the final piece, a human sacrifice who would willingly or unwillingly be part of their ritual. My heart raced as I read through the details, each line more disturbing than the last. The person writing the post claimed to be the last known resident of the building, but they had left before the ritual could be completed. The words blurred on the screen as a wave of nausea washed over me. It couldn't be real, could it? Cults, rituals, it sounded absurd, but every instinct in me screamed that it was true, that the people in this building weren't just ordinary neighbors. They were something else, something ancient and terrible. I tried to laugh it off, but the fear gnawing at my insides refused to let go. I knew I had to leave, to get out before it was too late. But as I began packing, the lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging the apartment into darkness. Panic surged through me, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone, only to realize I had no signal. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick and heavy, like a presence waiting in the dark. Then I heard it, soft footsteps just outside my door, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, backing away, watching the shadows under the door stretch as someone, or something, passed by. My entire body trembled as I heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. The door creaked open slightly, and I stifled a scream, pressing myself against the wall as I watched a hand slip through the crack. It was a gnarled, bony hand, pale as death, with fingers that seemed too long, too sharp. I closed my eyes, praying it was just a nightmare, but when I opened them again, the hand was gone, and the door was closed, as if it had never opened. I stayed there, frozen, waiting for the nightmare to end, but the silence that followed was even worse. It was as if the entire building was holding its breath, waiting. I knew then that I was trapped, that whatever these people were, they wouldn't stop until they had me. As the darkness pressed in around me, a single thought echoed in my mind, filling me with a terror I couldn't escape. I was the final piece, and the ritual had already begun. I didn't sleep at all that night. The darkness seemed alive, pressing in on me, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. The silence wasn't the kind that brought peace. It was thick, oppressive, a void where any sound could mean something was coming for me. Every creak of the floor, every soft murmur of the walls settling, felt like a whisper from the shadows, reminding me that I was trapped. When dawn finally crept into the apartment, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if the daylight might somehow protect me, though I knew it wouldn't last. I decided I couldn't stay here another night. I needed to leave, to escape this building and its residents before they completed whatever twisted ritual they had planned. I grabbed a suitcase and started packing my things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. Shadows clung to every corner, and the faint smell of candle wax hung in the air, making my stomach twist. As I packed, I heard voices outside my door again. Not the soft murmurs this time, but louder, more insistent. They were chanting, rhythmic and hollow, in a language I didn't recognize. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the words seeped through the walls and pressed into my skull, leaving me dizzy and lightheaded. They were speaking about me, calling me by name, as if I were a part of their chant. Summoning what little courage I had left, I approached the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was filled with my neighbors, all of them standing still, their faces devoid of emotion, eyes locked on my door. They were holding candles, the flames casting flickering shadows that danced along the walls in strange patterns. I could see the landlord at the front of the group, holding something in his hands, a bundle wrapped in fabric, worn and frayed. The chanting grew louder, more urgent, and I could feel the words vibrating in my bones, calling to me, pulling me toward the door. A voice inside me screamed to run, to escape while I still could, but something stronger, something I couldn't control, kept my feet rooted to the ground. It was as if an invisible hand was pressing me forward, urging me to open the door and step into the darkness that awaited me. My hands shook as I reached for the lock, my mind screaming at me to stop, to resist. But my body moved on its own, and before I knew it, the door was open. The chanting stopped. They all looked at me, their faces blank, eyes as empty as hollow graves. The landlord stepped forward, a twisted smile spreading across his face, and he held out the bundle. "It's time," he said softly, his voice filled with something ancient and terrible. "You are the final piece." I shook my head, stumbling back, but they didn't move. The landlord placed the bundle in my hands, the fabric soft and worn, but it felt heavy, as if it were filled with something alive, something waiting. My stomach twisted as I unwrapped it, revealing a small, ornate mirror, its surface covered in dust. My reflection stared back at me, but there was something wrong. The face in the mirror was my own, but distorted, twisted by fear, as if it had been waiting in that glass for me. A cold hand clamped onto my shoulder, and I gasped, turning to see my neighbors closing in around me, their eyes unblinking, faces expressionless. "You belong to us now," one of them whispered, their voice soft but filled with a hunger that made my skin crawl. They moved closer, their hands reaching out, pressing me back, forcing me toward the mirror. The room felt like it was spinning, the walls closing in, the shadows reaching for me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. I could feel their hands on me, pulling, dragging me toward the mirror, their voices blending into a single haunting chant that echoed in my mind over and over. The final piece, the final piece. As they pressed me closer, the mirror's surface seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. I could see my own reflection, but behind it, a darkness loomed, deeper and more terrible than anything I had ever known. My own face stared back at me, twisted in fear, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. And then in a heartbeat, I was pulled into the mirror, the world tilting and spinning as I was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing I saw was my own apartment, empty and quiet, as my neighbors filed out of the room, their expressions serene, satisfied. The door closed behind them, and I was left alone, trapped within the mirror, my silent scream echoing back at me. I'd always liked the idea of living alone. For years I'd shared cramped apartments with roommates, each of us clinging to whatever small corner of privacy we could carve out. So, when I finally moved into my own place, a small but cozy one-bedroom apartment just outside Seattle, it felt like a dream. I decorated it with little touches that made it feel like home. Plants in the windows, a collection of mismatched mugs in the kitchen, and small mirrors on the walls to reflect the natural light that streamed in during the day. At first, everything seemed perfect. The building was old, with creaky floors and a slight musty smell, but I found it charming. My neighbors were quiet, mostly older folks who nodded politely in the hallways and kept to themselves. It was the kind of place where I could finally relax, away from the constant noise of the city. But after a few weeks, I started noticing strange things. It was subtle at first, just small details that seemed off. One night, I walked past the mirror in my bathroom, and for a split second, it felt like my reflection was a bit slower than usual, lagging behind by just a fraction of a second. I laughed it off, thinking I was tired and imagining things, and chalked it up to the weird lighting in the bathroom. But the feeling didn't go away. Each time I passed a mirror in the house, I felt a slight unease, like the person looking back at me wasn't exactly me. The feeling was faint, but it lingered, a cold pinprick of doubt that grew sharper with each glance. I tried to ignore it, reasoning that it was just part of adjusting to a new place. Maybe I just wasn't used to seeing my own face this much, I told myself. As the days passed, the oddity in my reflection grew harder to ignore. I'd catch myself pausing in front of mirrors, staring at my reflection longer than usual, searching for any sign that something was wrong. I'd raise my hand, testing if the reflection would follow immediately. Each time it did, but the feeling of unease never left. There was something in the way it looked back at me that I couldn't quite explain. It was as if my reflection was studying me, mirroring my actions perfectly but with a slight delay, like someone trying to imitate me and not quite getting it right. The nights were the worst. The apartment, once a cozy haven, felt more like a cold shell after dark. The quiet that I had once found peaceful now seemed oppressive, pressing down on me as I moved through the rooms. The The mirrors, which I had placed strategically to open up the small space, now felt like windows to something else. Every time I passed by one, I felt the urge to look away, but something always drew my gaze back, an inexplicable need to make sure my reflection was still there, behaving the way it should. One night I decided to test it. I stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom, meeting my own gaze, and I raised my right hand slowly. My reflection did the same, perfectly synchronized. I tilted my head, watching my reflection mimic the movement precisely. But then, as I lowered my hand, something strange happened. For a split second, my reflection's eyes seemed to linger, just a little too long, holding the gaze even as I looked away. It was barely noticeable, but it sent a chill down my spine. I backed away from the mirror, my heart pounding. "You're just tired," I whispered to myself, trying to steady my breathing. But the fear was there, crawling under my skin, whispering that something was very wrong. The following morning, I avoided the mirrors as much as possible, moving quickly through the apartment and keeping my head down. But I couldn't ignore them forever. By midday, I found myself staring again, this time at the mirror in the hallway. The feeling was back, stronger than ever. My reflection looked just like me, of course, but there was a strange expression in its eyes, something dark, almost curious, like it was studying me rather than just reflecting. I told myself it was ridiculous. There was nothing wrong with my reflection. It was just a mirror, and I was letting my imagination run wild. But no matter how many times I tried to reassure myself, the feeling of unease lingered. Each time I passed a mirror, I felt like my reflection was waiting for something, watching me a little too closely. The unease began to creep into other parts of my life. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, even when I was alone in my apartment. I started leaving the lights on at night, too afraid to let the shadows settle. And every time I went to bed, I felt an inexplicable dread that I couldn't shake. Days turned into weeks, and the feeling only grew worse. I found myself avoiding the mirrors altogether, doing my best to go about my day without meeting my own gaze. But no matter how hard I tried, I could feel my reflection lurking, just out of sight, waiting for me to look, to acknowledge it. It was as if it had a life of its own, a presence that grew stronger each day. Then one night something changed. I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in the bathroom, when I looked up and saw it. My reflection was standing there, looking back at me, but there was something different, something wrong. My face in the mirror was smiling, a slow, twisted grin that didn't belong to me. I froze, toothbrush still in my mouth, staring in horror as the smile grew wider, stretching across my reflection's face. My heart pounded, my breath catching in my throat. I dropped the toothbrush and stumbled back, but my reflection stayed where it was, grinning at me with a look of dark amusement. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, it raised its hand and waved. I stumbled out of the bathroom that night, heart pounding, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I could still feel the cold, mocking stare of my own reflection lingering in my mind. That smile etched into my memory like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. I told myself I'd just imagined it, that it was the result of exhaustion, stress, maybe even a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew there was something wrong. Something was watching me, and I was powerless to stop it. The following days, I avoided every mirror in the apartment. I covered the one in the bathroom with an old towel, hoping that by blocking it out, I'd stop feeling its pull. But every time I walked past a reflective surface, even the small glass window in the door, I felt it. An inexplicable urge to look, to see if it was still there, watching, waiting. At first I thought that ignoring it would make the feeling go away, that the tension would fade and things would go back to normal. But the presence didn't disappear. Instead, it seemed to grow stronger, creeping into every corner of my life, filling the apartment with an oppressive energy that seemed to whisper to me from the shadows. I began to hear faint sounds at night, the softest of creaks coming from the mirrors, like something shifting, moving, trying to break free. One evening, as I sat in the living room attempting to distract myself with a book, I heard it again, the faintest whisper of movement from the hallway mirror. I glanced up, the familiar dread settling in my stomach, and saw it, my own reflection, standing in the hallway mirror, staring back at me with an intensity that felt almost predatory. But there was something different this time. It didn't move with me. While I sat frozen, my reflection took a step forward, its eyes never leaving mine. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the mirror. My reflection stood perfectly still now, as if frozen in place, but its eyes tracked my every movement, dark and hungry. I grabbed the closest cloth and threw it over the mirror, covering its surface, feeling a strange sense of relief as the image vanished. But the relief was short-lived. As I turned away, I felt a chill run down my spine, a cold dread that I couldn't shake. I knew, in that moment, that whatever was in that mirror wasn't just my reflection. It was something else, something that wanted to be here, to be me. And it was only getting stronger. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that twisted smile, the way it had waved at me, mocking and unnatural. I lay in bed, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of its presence pressing in around me. I knew it was waiting, lurking just behind the glass, watching me from every darkened corner. The following morning, I woke to find the covers pulled off every mirror in the apartment. The towel I'd placed over the bathroom mirror lay crumpled on the floor, and the cloth I'd used in the hallway was neatly folded on the chair beside it. My heart raced as I took in the sight, the sense of violation sinking into my bones. It was as if the reflection was showing me that I couldn't hide from it, that no matter what I did, it would always be there, waiting for me to look. Desperation clawed at me, and I grabbed my phone, searching for answers. I found forums filled with people discussing strange experiences with mirrors, but nothing came close to what I was dealing with. I read about old legends of reflections capturing parts of your soul, or tales of mirror walkers, entities that could travel between realms through reflective surfaces. The stories sounded like superstitions, yet they resonated with the horror I felt. I spent the entire day trying to avoid the mirrors, but I could feel it watching me, lurking just out of sight. Every time I moved through the apartment, it was there, waiting for me to meet its gaze. As night fell, the air grew colder, the oppressive silence pressing in around me, thick and heavy. I felt trapped, cornered in my own home, with no escape from the thing that wanted to take my place. Finally, unable to stand the tension any longer, I decided to confront it. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my own reflection, searching for any hint of that twisted, mocking grin. For a moment, everything seemed normal. My reflection gazed back, mirroring my every move, its expression neutral. But then, slowly, I raised my hand to wave. My reflection hesitated, just for a split second, before raising its hand in return. A wave of nausea rolled over me as I realized that my reflection wasn't moving in sync. It was copying me, but with a delay, like it was struggling to keep up. I took a step back, and this time, it didn't follow. It stood still, its eyes narrowing, watching me with a look that sent chills down my spine. It was no longer just a reflection. It was something else, something alive, and it was looking at me with an intensity that felt wrong, invasive, like it was studying every inch of me. I stumbled back, clutching the edge of the sink as the realization hit me. Whatever was in that mirror wanted to replace me. It was waiting for the moment when I'd slip, when I'd give it the chance to cross over. I fled from the bathroom, slamming the door behind me, heart pounding in my chest as the horror of the situation settled in. But even in the safety of my room, I couldn't escape it. I felt its presence lurking just beyond the walls, its gaze piercing through the darkness, waiting for me to look again, to acknowledge it. I knew then that it wouldn't stop until it took my place, that every time I looked away, it grew stronger, more determined. As I lay in bed that night, shivering under the covers, I could feel it, a cold presence hovering just out of sight, watching, waiting, and I knew that, sooner or later, it would find a way out. I didn't sleep that night. The cold, oppressive feeling of being watched crept into every corner of my apartment. Every flicker of shadow felt like it belonged to that twisted reflection, lingering just outside my vision, waiting for me to slip, to look back and acknowledge it. I tried to tell myself that I was losing it, that everything I'd experienced was some twisted product of exhaustion or stress, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I knew that if I made one wrong move, it would be my last. The following morning, I woke to an eerie silence. The light through the windows seemed dimmer than usual, and the air was thick, almost suffocating. I forced myself to move, to get out of bed and start my day as if nothing was wrong. But every mirror in the apartment was uncovered. I'd hidden them, thrown sheets and towels over every reflective surface, yet now each one was exposed, as if taunting me, daring me to look. Something had shifted. I could feel it deep in my bones, an electric charge in the air that made my skin crawl. I avoided the mirrors as best as I could, keeping my eyes down as I went about the morning routine, refusing to acknowledge their presence. But as I turned to leave the bathroom, I saw it. The reflection. It was standing in the mirror, watching me with a dark, twisted expression, its eyes wide and gleaming with a hunger I'd never seen before. My heart raced as I stared, frozen in place. It wasn't just looking at me this time. It was pressing against the surface, its hands flattening against the glass, the fingertips stretched almost to the breaking point as if it were trying to push through. I took a step back, horrified, as cracks began to form along the edges of the mirror, spidering out like veins. The reflection leaned forward, its face close to the glass, its smile spreading in a twisted grin that stretched too wide, too unnatural. And then it spoke. "Let me out." The words were soft, barely a whisper, but they echoed through the room, filling every inch of space with a sinister weight. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, my mind screaming at me to run, but I was rooted in place, unable to tear my gaze away from the figure in the mirror. It was no longer my reflection. It was something else entirely, a being of pure malice, and it was coming for me. Desperate, I turned and fled, slamming the bathroom door shut behind me. I could hear the faint sound of glass cracking, splintering under the pressure as I raced through the apartment, my mind frantic with fear. I had to do something, anything, to get rid of it. I grabbed a heavy blanket and threw it over the hallway mirror, my hands shaking as I secured it in place, hoping that somehow it would keep the thing contained. But as I moved to cover the other mirrors, I felt it. A chill crept up my spine, a cold, hollow presence that seemed to pulse with dark intent. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see, and there it was, my reflection, standing in the uncovered mirror by the front door, its eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It lifted its hand, pressing it against the glass, and I watched in horror as its fingers began to push through, stretching beyond the surface. I stumbled back, the world spinning around me, my mind racing with panic. I had to stop it, had to find a way to break the connection, to sever whatever link it had to this world. In a final act of desperation, I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, an old metal candlestick, and brought it down against the mirror, shattering the glass into 1,000 fragments. The room echoed with the sound of breaking glass, and for a moment there was silence. But as I looked down, I realized with a sickening dread that the shards still held pieces of my reflection. Each tiny fragment showed a piece of its twisted face, the eyes wide with fury, the smile frozen in a manic, malevolent grin. The fragments trembled, shifting slightly on the floor, as if each shard was still alive, still connected to the thing inside the mirror. I backed away, my heart pounding, my mind reeling with fear. The reflection hadn't been destroyed, it was still there, scattered across the floor, lurking in every tiny piece of glass, watching me, waiting. I knew then that I couldn't stay. I left the apartment, grabbing only the essentials, leaving the shattered pieces behind. But as I walked out the door, I caught one last glimpse of the bathroom mirror, and my blood ran cold. In the fractured surface, a single eye stared back at me, furious and unblinking, filled with a dark promise. Since that day, I haven't looked in a mirror. I avoid reflective surfaces, terrified of what I might see looking back. But every now and then, in a window or a puddle on the street, I catch a glimpse, a flash of that twisted grin, that unnatural gleam in its eyes, and I know that it's still out there, waiting, biding its time. It hasn't given up. It's waiting for the moment when I'll make the mistake of looking too long, of letting it see me. And when I do, I know that it'll be ready.